Great. Welcome, everybody. Let's start this session, and I'd like to say hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the UN Global Compact session on Ocean Now. We're going to talk about our ambitions for shipping and towards COP26. And I'm Suzanne Johnson, Senior Advisor for the Global Compact's Ocean Initiative. You know, when you think about it, we were last together at Ocean Now at North Shipping about 2 years ago, and the conversation around the shipping decarbonization was well underway by then. The IMO had pledged to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2050, but since then there's been a big change in attitudes, and there's a greater sense of urgency around this change. The global discussion on emissions reduction, it now speaks openly about a 1.5 degree trajectory, and this means reaching net zero by 2050. So we need to see action from across the entire shipping value chain, from fuel source to end user, with a dose of an appropriate market-based signals to level the playing field. In the past week, we've actually seen a number of signs of change coming. For example, the courts ordered Shell to accelerate emissions cuts, and shareholders forced the hand of Exxon by placing climate activists on the board. Each of these decisions shows changing stakeholder expectations in the field of shipping decarbonization. And there will be implications for the shipping industry. Shipping companies' environmental records are going to be highlighted, and there's going to be impact on the offshore services sector, which is a major part of the shipping industry. Also, we saw in the US that it announced that it is upping its efforts to work with countries at the IMO to achieve zero emissions from international shipping by 2050. And that represents a more ambitious decarbonization goal than the IMO has set so far. So actions like these signal that business as usual for our industry is not an option anymore. And companies need to take action to make changes needed to achieve a net zero future. But also in the last week, I wanted to mention that the Global Compact published practical guidances for the shipping sector on how to adopt the Sustainable Ocean Principles. And this set of guidance sets out directions for the industry to align its activities with the sector's best ESG practices. And I would encourage us all to take a look at that. But another framework that I wanted to mention was that shipping companies can join Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign. And the UN Global Compact, along with the UN Secretary General, have called on companies to join the campaign to set a net zero target in line with 1.5. So if you commit to Business Ambition for 1.5, you also sign up to COP26's Race to Zero campaign. And the Race to Zero has specific targets laid out for the international shipping industry. In today's meeting, we're going to discuss, excuse me, my notes just went off. So let me just, but anyway, let's talk about that. While I sign in today's meeting, we're going to discuss how we can reach those targets. And I wanted to introduce Ines Beguin, who's the UNFCCC high-level climate champion, Ocean Lead, who will talk with us about what you're doing in the Race to Zero. And then he'll introduce his colleague, the shipping lead, Peter Osterkamp. Ines, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and hello, everyone. I'm Ines Beguin, Ocean Lead for the UNFCCC Climate Champions. And today, myself and my colleague, Peter Osterkamp, will present you the Climate Champions work and the Race to Zero, and maybe the pathway we have defined for the shipping industry to decarbonize and the targets we've set. At the Climate Champions, our mandate is to drive non-state actors' mobilization and support of more ambitious climate plans. The Climate Champions are civil society leaders who are officially appointed by member states and the UNFCCC. Currently, the champions are Gonzalo Munoz for Chile and Nigel Topping for the UK. our efforts are organized around two main campaigns, the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience. The Race to Zero, it's a global campaign which is aiming to rely leadership and support from businesses, cities, region, investors for a zero carbon future. It is the largest ever alliance committed to achieving net zero carbon emission by 2050. Today, it represents about 25 regions, 700 cities, 2,400 companies, and more than 200 investors, alone making up over 15% of the global economy. So by joining the Race to Zero, companies commit to drastically cut greenhouse gas emission by, first of all, setting intermediate targets to halve emission by 2030 and achieving net zero emission as soon as possible and by 2050 at the very latest. Joining this journey is demonstrating climate leadership to your employees, investors, customers, and driving change in your supply chains. But it's also aiming to
Okay, I think Inas, sorry about that, everybody, but I think Inas is frozen. So it would be great then if we can move on while Inas is frozen to his colleague, Peter Osterkamp, who is the shipping lead for the high-level climate champions. Peter, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suzanne. I'm sorry to see my colleague there not froze. I think on the point of Race to Zero and companies signing up, I think the important point there is the signal effect that can have when it comes to these feedback loops, that we see that companies commit, thereby regulators have more confidence in setting the right regulation, which in turn can create this feedback loop of actions. I think that was kind of the end to what Ignacio was getting at. So on my end, looking at shipping, and I think I might have forgot, Peter Osterkamp's my name, yes, shipping lead for the champion. So I want to talk a little bit about this next 10-year time frame that is kind of the focus of the climate champions. What's the needed in the next 10 years? And for all the sectors we work with, it's obviously the goal to achieve a 1.5 degree aligned trajectory. And the question is then, how does that transition look and how far can we get in the next decade? And we know from history there that every large transition in industry in this way, or technology transition, has happened in an S-curve shape. You have an early phase that goes very slowly, then you reach a tipping point, and then the speed goes exponentially until you reach kind of another steady state. And I think this point on the S-shaped curve and exponential growth is important, because our brains are hardwired to think linearly. And if we think linearly when it comes to technology transitions, we make the wrong assumptions, and that leads to bad decisions. So for instance, if you look at the last 20 years of electric vehicle sales, and if you were to extrapolate a linear development, that would mean you need about 80 years to get to zero. But if you take into account the exponential change, then it's the rate of doubling that's important. And EV take-up is doubling every 18 months. And extrapolating that, you get to 0 or 100% new EV sales by the early 2030s. And that's where most policymakers and car companies are now starting to aim for. So we wanted to employ the same approach when looking at shipping. So what we did is took analysis that UMass had conducted a couple of years ago on feasible pathways to 1.5 degrees for shipping, and basically tried to fit an S-curve to that analysis, to that research that they did bottom up. And what we arrived at is that you'd basically need to reach about 5% zero-emission fuels to make up about 5% of the energy for shipping for international shipping by 2030. So we see that as the tipping point, if you will, or the breakthrough ambition for shipping. The next question then is, how do you get there? And shipping, like many industries, is a complicated, interconnected ecosystem of actors, and it's impossible to map out now all the steps needed all the way to 2050. So we come back again to what's needed now in the next decade. And as you, Suzanne, said early on here, we need all parts of the shipping ecosystem to play their part. I mean, shipping companies can commit to buying zero carbon ready vessels. I think Maersk's recent announcement is an example of that. We need energy companies to ensure the fuel will be available and drive down the cost. We have several energy companies in the green hydrogen catapult that are committed to just this. Finances need to favor investment in the zero carbon solutions and avoid supporting dead-end technologies. We have a number of finances involved in the Poseidon principles. The World Bank has come out with a report showing their perspective that LNG is not a feasible pathway forward. So there are things happening there as well. Customers need to demand zero carbon shipping and likely early on be willing to pay a small premium for this. And here, especially the customer-facing or consumer-facing companies have a big role to play, since many of them are already committed to decarbonization in line with Paris. So they need to sort their logistics chains as well. And finally, and possibly most importantly in shipping, we need regulation that creates a living playing field. And here I think the recent proposal from the Marshall Islands and Solomon Islands of a carbon levy to be discussed in the upcoming IMO meeting is obviously very interesting. So I think that's our perspective from the climate champions when it comes to the shipping sector. And I'll just round off by saying the eyes of the world will be on Glasgow and COP26 in November, and all sectors will need to have something to show them when it comes to progress on climate. So thank you very much, and I'm very looking forward to hearing the perspectives of the participants in today's panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Petter, and thanks, Ignace. Let's move on now to our panel then, because you talked about change is exponential, and you identified this 5% breakthrough ambition. I want to hear from our panel who come from all different parts of the maritime value chain. You know, what can be done to start making zero emission ships a more dominant choice by 2030, and talking about the climate champions breakthrough ambition. So let's turn to Guy Platten. Guy, you're the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping, and that represents over 80% of the world shipping fleet. So how can the ICS help to meet the 5% target? And what do you think are the priority actions? Guy?
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you all today. Firstly, I'd say this is the major item on ship owners' sort of to-do list now as well. There's a real sense of urgency, which I haven't really felt before, and so there's a real need and desire to actually to go beyond and to get to a zero carbon future. So I say there's two things that need to happen. Both are happening in parallel. Firstly, we need the research and development at scale to the technologies to enable us to transition to zero carbon. We've proposed as an industry, and it's now been sponsored by major shipping countries, including Greece, Japan, Liberia, Malta, Denmark, Switzerland, and others, to get governments to approve a $5 billion IMO Maritime Research Fund at the upcoming Mepc. And this will basically entail mandatory contributions from shipping companies across the world for every ton of fuel they burn, which is then linked to the carbon emissions. Because this fund is essential, we've got a fleet of 65,000 ships, and zero emission technology is at an infinitesimal scale at this now. So with a life cycle of 25 years, we really need to start acting now. We need to start investing now if we're going to achieve those very challenging goals. According to the IEA, several of the technologies that are needed to move the maritime shipping subsector towards carbon neutrality are not yet commercially available. Promising developments exist: ammonia, hydrogen, and of course electric battery power, but each has its challenges to become commercially viable. For example, it would take 10,000 Tesla batteries to power one container ship for one day, or the vast majority of the world's green ammonia supplies to power shipping alone. If the global fleet adopted green ammonia fuel, ammonia production would have to rise by 440 million tonnes, requiring 750 gigawatts of renewable energy. So at the current rate, we would consume 60% of the world's current renewable energy production. So some challenges and some mountains to climb. But we've identified at least 200 projects that merit investment. And we've also developed a prototype of our payment system for the R&D fund, so we can hit the ground running and really make that R&D count in the years to come. This proposal we've got is completely oven ready, and with the will of governments could happen within a year or so. In addition to that, we also recognise the need. It's not just research and development, but we also have to have market incentives to reach decarbonisation goals. And we heard from the people speak about the proposal from the Marshall Islands. We welcome this debate. We submitted ourselves a proposal to the IMO calling the regulatory body to bring forward discussions around market-based measures. We think this is absolutely critical to get, firstly, to get the R&D at scale, and then to incentivise the industry through all the things that have been said so far in order to make that transition. And I fully agree with the S-shaped curve as well, but we need that initial impetus now to get that R&D there, and then also invest in the new fuel technology and get the market-based measures to make us move towards zero carbon fuels. So hopefully that's in a nutshell where we stand. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. That's great. Yeah, we need to get technology to be commercially ready. That's a great point. And we really need to get a little bit more into these market-based measures. And I think we'll talk about that during this session. Let's turn to Nick Brown. Nick, you're the CEO of Lloyd's Register, which gives advice to the shipping industry on technical and regulatory challenges. And LR has a new maritime decarbonization hub, which helps to accelerate safe and sustainable transition in shipping. And I'd love to hear your view. In your view, what needs to happen today in order to get to that 5%?
Thank you, Suzanne. And first of all, I would agree with Peder's comments around the S-curve, and also Guy's opening remarks around this being, the key topic. Of course, the other key topic is still crew welfare and the crew change crisis. But I think in terms of all of the customers that are reaching out to Lloyd's Register for advice, the hottest topic is around investment in both their existing fleets and investments in any new vessels that they might be considering in the coming decade, and what they could do to make them as robust an investment to avoid assets being trapped by investing in the wrong type of technologies or the wrong type of fuels. And the great news is that since we last spoke at this forum, as you say, Lloyd's Register has launched our decarbonisation hub. Before that, we already had a number of projects up and running, looking at deep sea cargo vessels. But we now have quite a portfolio of projects running under that decarbonisation hub umbrella that's looking at all different types of solutions that will work for cruise vessels, where the power and energy requirements are quite different to deep sea cargo vessels, and also solutions that will work for short sea shipping and coastal transportation needs. Based on the projects that we're working on, that's with engine makers, ship builders, ship designers, ship owners, port authorities, etc. We do believe that designs for these new vessels will be ready by 23, 24, and that would put ship owners in a position to actually consider ordering what will initially be dual fuel vessels. So let's remember the first vessels that can use zero carbon fuels, in order to protect the investment, will be dual fuel, and that probably means they'll run on a combination of an existing hydrocarbon fuel today and a zero carbon fuel when they become available in the ports. And that means that they could hit the water as quickly as 2025 or 2026. But as Guy has pointed out, in order for ship owners to actually have sufficient confidence to make that investment decision, what we do need is more clarity around the availability of the fuels. And that's why I'm delighted that Kaylee Hoon and Singapore government and Port Authority have joined one of our projects to ensure that we're looking at the land-based infrastructure as well as just the ship, so that when the ship arrives and is capable of loading a zero carbon fuel, we've got certainty around that fuel availability. But we also have the uncertainty around just how commercially viable will the fuels be, particularly in the first decade that we're focusing on today. Our research, which again has been done together with UMass and others, suggests that during the first decade, the new fuels will be 2 to 3 times more expensive than today's fuels. And that's why we would also support some really bold and robust discussions led by IMO around market-based measures, because we really do need to close that gap between the commercial attractiveness of today's fuels versus the commercial attractiveness of tomorrow's fuels, whether that's hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, or even electrification in some cases. We do need to close that competitive gap. But I think that's probably enough for me for an opening statement.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. That was really interesting. So you're thinking design ready 23, 24, ships in the water by 25, 26. That's a couple of years to wait still before we can order those vessels, but probably dual fuel in the near term. And the thing of it is 2 to 3 times more expensive in a fiercely competitive industry. That gap needs to be closed. So thanks very much. And actually, you mentioned Kay Hoon in talking about the landside infrastructure. So let's go to Lei Hoon. You are the chief executive of the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. And as we all know, Singapore is the shipping hub of the world. So if you think about it, over half of maritime emissions come from ships berthed in ports. And there's many things ports can do to make a difference, particularly through the infrastructure they provide. So Lei Hoon, how can port authorities help to scale up zero emission fuels?
Thanks, Suzanne, for the question. Indeed, it is a question which actually many port authorities, and including the IMO, is actually looking at. I would say that the key now is actually, as what Peter mentioned, as of course Guy and Nick has mentioned, is really what is the technological solution and breakthrough. We really require global collaboration around technological solution. It's the same and akin to electric cars, which Peter was talking about just now. Look at PV solar panels. In the past, it was very expensive. It wasn't very efficient. Adoption is at a very low rate. However, in recent days, the adoption is at an exponential level. So I think the question is, how do we tip the equation to reach that scale? And I think there needs to be at different levels. So I maybe talk a little bit about the industry before I come into the port. At the industry level, I think we need really collaboration for solutions. There are decarb centers which have been set up. Singapore as well. We've worked with industry players, 6 founding members from the private sector, who like what is mentioned earlier, that actually we are in the phase where, despite the pandemic, we actually see increasing interest and momentum in wanting to find a zero carbon solution or low carbon solution. And the momentum is there, the interest is there. So we are very actually relieved and glad that we have actually private sector players coming on board with us. And the whole objective is actually not to have just one decarb center, but to have a link ups with different decarb centers around the world, to have a link up of different projects that's going on, so that we can snowball the knowledge and allow common denominator, which I say, for example, safety standards, engine standards, standards that is a common denominator that can be promulgated that will allow and spur mass adoption. So I mean, we talk about technological solution, of course, financing needs to come in. The project, which is the International Maritime Research and Development Board or fund that is mentioned by ICS, definitely is something which Singapore support. And I think it will be a global measure that will allow to create some funding that's needed for R&D and to spur it forward for mass adoption. So that's one. Then I think the next is really talking about standards. And that's where port authorities, agencies like us, governments, where we can come in, because we are from Singapore at the national level preparing for a multi-fuel transition. I would say that for bunkering. We don't think that we will have one single fuel that will be a winning solution in the next 10 years. So within the next 10 years, we've already heard different companies sort of coming up with their own declaration on what are some of the energy types that they are pursuing, whether it's methanol, ethanol, ammonia, etc. And from MPA, we believe in joining an value chain ecosystem with the different companies, like what was mentioned earlier by Lloyd's Register, that we are looking at ammonia, for example, and that's where MPA can come in to try to work towards receiving vessels to be ready for different fuels, and at the same time ability to set the standards and actually push it up. Our experience with LNG bunkering is that it took us 8 years. 8 years to work with different port authorities to form that alliance and surface it up to ISO to be the common standard. We definitely need to shorten that learning process for new fuels or new energy that's coming on board. And therefore, we need to start today to start working with a coalition of port authorities on the standards of bunkering. So I will stop here. We can perhaps elaborate more later.
No, thank you very much. So you're linking up with projects around the world to try to de-risk these before it comes. And interesting that you see the next decade as being a multi-fuel decade. We got to shorten that time of 8 years for LNG, and it sounds as though your networks are working very hard. Thank you very much. And on that note, then let's turn towards the market on this and these multi-fuels. And I'd like to welcome Rasmus Bach-Nielsen. And he has recently taken up the global head role for fuel decarbonization at Trafigura, which is a company that we all know. It's a leading commodity and trading logistics house. So Rasmus, this places you at the center of understanding market incentives around the decarbonization. In your view, from where you see it, what needs to be done to get to this 5% target?
Okay, first of all, thank you. It's an honor to participate today. A lot needs to be done. Just to start a little bit from where we began, we did a study with a leading American university back in 2019 into 2020, and conclusion was that transport fuels of the future are hydrogen-based. So as of today, with the knowledge we have, it's probably most likely to be green ammonia or green methanol. So hydrogen-based. That led us on to produce our IMO-led carbon levy shipping decarbonization proposal, which we launched in September last year. So what needs to be done? I mean, we've been on a journey. We got ourselves to speak to a lot of people due to the proposal, and what I've seen and what we have seen is a tremendous progress since September last year. Initially, we had a lot of positive receipt, but we also had a lot of lack of belief. In January this year, I was on a Friends of the Ocean panel debate, and there was a Scandinavian climate ambassador who said, carbon levy will never happen. It was within the IMO in 2013, 2014, and it was turned down. It was very hard for me to accept that statement on a panel from a climate ambassador. Total lack of vision and dynamism. And what we're seeing, and this is what I will urge everyone, is to be dynamic, to believe that the future looks different than the past. And what do we need to do to make the future different than the past and the current? First and foremost, we need regulation. Without regulation, we will not manage to decarbonize sooner rather than later. And to make it clear, we do need to decarbonize sooner rather than later. Society has overtaken what technology is today capable of delivering. We all have requirements to decarbonize our infrastructure. We are all acknowledging that. I think there's no one, and your introduction obviously describes it very well, with the court ruling with Shell and Exxon board members being turned down. Things have changed. And unfortunately, we cannot wait 3 to 4 to 5 years for IMO to make a decision on cost neutralizing low and zero carbon fuels, because that's what needs to happen. We need the low and zero carbon fuels to be cost neutralized. There was a comment from I think Peter, and I generally agree with more or less everything you say, Peter, but what about the fuel availability? The challenge that we have today, and sitting deep within a trade organization, and I was running the global shipping business before on the oil and gas side, where we had a significant fleet, and as another comment, we do more than 4,000 shipping contracts per annum. So I've seen how behaviors are within a significant cargo mover. Well, what needs to happen? We need to have that regulation, and when we have that, you will encourage and incentivize and make it possible to make investments into hydrogen-based fuels. Today, you have a chicken and egg situation. The chicken and egg situation is that the shipping companies are saying there's no fuels, and the pension funds who are ready to invest trillions and trillions of dollars into hydrogen-based fuels are waiting for the demand. Together, we're waiting for that golden regulation, and I say golden because that is what will trigger everything. And talking about the curves that Peter referenced to, I've already seen it in the last 9 months since we came up with our proposal. That curve is in full motion, and more than what anyone could ever believe. So, and leading towards COP26, and for what we're talking about here today, I think what is absolutely critical is that IMO members, they understand that the mandate that they have more or less already been given, although bureaucracy is high. Then the second point is, so that's what's for MEPC 76, well, challenge yourself and believe that the world wants change. IMO needs to make change happen. Secondly, COP26, transport and climate ministers, well, they need to understand as well that we need regulation to happen. Because when we have regulation, that price differential can take place. And as a side comment as well, if you look at green ammonia on forward basis for 26, 27 delivery, the price is around 450 to 500 euros per metric tons, approximately, from what we're seeing today. And the calorific value is 2.2 times less than the transport fuels you have today. So then you can easily do the math. That will not work. We need that regulation to happen. And so to answer your question, well, if what we are doing, we're pushing all our efforts into regulation. But of course, it doesn't mean that companies does not have responsibility, optimizing their fleets, looking at how you can otherwise create an infrastructure, whether that's in partnerships, as Ms. Keely has pointed out, we're part of one ourselves, which will soon be publicized. And there's a lot happening within the industries. And of course, we need to push all these measures forward. But first and foremost, carbon levy has to happen. And then you will see the biggest wave that we have probably never seen before. So it's a historical opportunity, it's a historical challenge, but we also have a historical responsibility. The world is ready. So thank you.
Thank you, Rasmus. Okay, we need the carbon levy, we need regulation, and that holds the keys to closing the price differential. So yeah, thank you very much. And you've been so active in that effort. Now let's turn to Knut Orbeck Nielsen, who is the CEO of DNV Maritime. And as we all know, that's a leader in classification, and they provide decarbonization advice to the maritime industry. And Knut, you've spoken about shipping decarbonization as one of the grand challenges of our time. And you've recently launched an alternative fuels insight platform, which provides an open platform for evaluating the uptake of alternative fuel. So from this perspective, tell us what you think you can do to help achieve the 5% target. Knut?
Thank you, Suzanne, for the introduction and the question. A lot has been said already, so before I get directly to your question, I would like to make a couple of comments seen from my perspective. So what we all can share is the ambition level that we really need to make a difference, that we really need to shift towards decarbonization. And as you say, it's the grand challenge of our time. So I think all of us here and many in the industry share that ambition. And it's good to see that that momentum is growing. Having said that, I think that we all have to sort of also be pragmatic and realize that we are really trying to have a transition going on from a very much hydrocarbon-based reality to something which is much better for the next decades. And our research really shows that if you look at the availability of the, say, zero carbon or lesser carbon intensive fuel types, it is really a lot of work that needs to be done to come up with a solution. So I do agree with Rasmus that regulation is key, but also solutions are really required. And in our studies, we've seen that for this decade and probably most of next decade, we still are very much reliant on hydrocarbon-based fuels. And I know that's not the best music to play in this panel, perhaps, but at least it's a bit of reality in this. So what I'm after is really a transition, and I do disagree with what was commented on in the beginning by Mr. Osterkamp, that LNG is not a solution. Our research shows that LNG is really a very favorable transition fuel, and that transition could be quite lengthy. And before you look at some of the, say, future alternatives, ammonia was mentioned, methanols, hydrogen, it's not really available at any great quantity. The price is uncertain. It's probably quite high. The infrastructure is most likely not in the places where it is needed. So I think we really have to get a start and move on some of the practicalities that does exist, like LNG as fuel. And then we have to do our research. And I really support Guy's comments and the ICS's initiative on the R&D fund. This was also, I think, shared by all the other panelists. It is really about investing in R&D to find better solutions for the future, and a lot of work needs to be done. And that is what I think Nick from Lloyd's Register, myself, we have a role to play, not only in carrying out the research, but also in making sure that the transition can be safe. After all, we don't really want any safety issues around the complexity that all the new fuel types, the new solutions, the new technologies might involve. And that brings me to the next point on the R&D side. We really need to accelerate the R&D effort. And I must say, I'm so glad that we, together with Lloyd's Register and a few other leading class societies at Flag State, could come together to share the research work that we are doing on these type of issues. And you can imagine we're all individually doing research with our industry partners, but coming together in the Maritime Technology Forum sort of puts a multiplier of 7 on that research. And I think that really can help provide good guidance and hopefully good solutions for the industry going forward. And collaboration, I think, is really the key. This is not, say, a competitive situation, although you name the campaign A Race to Zero. I think it is not really a competition. We're all in this together. And when Ms. Kwale Hun talk about the Decarbonization Center in Singapore, where we are one of the founding members, I think this is really the key, that we as an industry with the multiple stakeholders reach out and try to collaborate on these issues to find good solutions, and that way leave the industry and the world at a better place for those that come after us and pick up the relay. So I will stop there for now. Thank you.
No, thank you, Knut. Thank you very much. Yeah, so this is a transition. It's not a binary switch. We need to take a collaborative approach, and it's great to see the different initiatives that you talked about and people coming together to share thoughts and provide good guidance, because we need to find solutions safely during this transition period. Okay, well, thanks to the panel on that. I think that set us up for a next round of questions that are more individual this time, because I wanted to hit on a number of other points. So I want to turn back to Guy again. And let's talk about the equitable nature of this transition and the decarbonization transition. So if you think about this $1 trillion opportunity from decarbonizing shipping, you know, the vast majority of it comes from land-based infrastructure. And a recent World Bank report said that both developed and developing countries have an opportunity to take advantage of this potential. And it used to be that that was mostly going to companies with lots of oil. So Guy, tell us how we can unlock the potential for developing countries in the transition.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think it's an incredibly important point as well, because if we are going to bring everyone with us, we've got to provide those opportunities for all. And I think certainly that is the concern of many developing nations, as they will be left behind in the race to zero carbon. So we really are in favour of an accessible new fuel market, which is why we want the member states to ratify the global R&D fund that we've talked about as well, because that will help in that process very much so. That we'll be able to invest in technology across the world over, rather than concentrated in one or two places as it could be otherwise. And we know that governments are going to have to play a critical role in supporting this transition of the shipping centre, and working together, both developed and developing nations, to generate the potential economic development of this transition. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity to really plough a new route forward. It's vital that the future of zero carbon fuels is done equitably, and investments are made to ensure that those developing nations can develop infrastructure to produce and bunker alternative zero emission fuels. It's not good enough to have some highly concentrated, highly industrial places that are available fuels there if you can't then get it in the developing nations. So there is that opportunity to work together. The International Renewable Energy Arena has stated that only 1% of the current hydrogen supply comes from renewable energy. Any additional capacity of zero carbon fuel supports not only the decarbonisation agenda of the power sector, but our decarbonisation efforts from shipping too, and that must be across the globe in developing and developed nations as well. Developing countries face different contexts and opportunities for the development of zero carbon fuels, both for the short and the long term. Each country will potentially seek investments to develop their different renewable energy potential, whether it's biomass or other technologies such as solar and wind. So to achieve the emissions reduction goals, developing countries will likely face regulatory capabilities and economic challenges, and it's up to all of us now to work together to solve them, to make sure this opportunity is spread evenly across the world and we can lift more people out of poverty, which is what shipping does in terms of trade and investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. That very interesting. And that said, the transition needs to help everybody, and not just the rich countries and not just particular people. So thanks for your insight there. And now let me turn back to Rasmus and talk a little bit more. I wanted to dig a little bit more into the market incentives that you talk about at your IMO efforts. And if you could talk a little bit more about those, but also I'd be interested to hear what you think success looks like at the MEPC meeting in June. So could you elaborate on what you talked about before? And when you think about it, what can private sector actors do to maximize the opportunity for what you see as a successful outcome at the MEPC?
Okay, thanks. What is success at MEPC? I already think it was a success that Marshall Islands led carbon levy proposal came forward. It took some while for them to gain confidence that it was going to be realistic, and obviously since it was proposed, mindsets have moved drastically in the last 2 to 3 months. So the first achievement has been made, but obviously now it's there. Now we need to see what's next. I think, or in our view, everyone has to put their mindset on long-term measures and then market-based measures. It's such a crucial aspect, and we need it to be totally addressed to lead up to decision-making sooner rather than later at a future MEPC meeting. And Obviously, these things takes time, but highest possible focus on a carbon levy is what we can determine as success. And obviously, there will be a lot of discussion around it. We don't agree with the revenue distribution around the Marshall Island proposal, which is a fully loaded proposal for funds back to small island states. We believe the primary part of funds should go back into the industry. We have proposed in our proposal, we have proposed a fund where charters, including ourselves, we pay a price if we charter ships with a carbon profile higher than the benchmark. And then if we charter ships with lower than the benchmark, that gets subsidized with money accumulated from the fund. So we believe the money should actually be channeled primarily back into the industry. And why is that so important? Because that's how you can cost neutralize low and zero carbon fuels without a carbon levy costing money for various governments. The problem can be taken care of within the industry, in our view. But however, what we need is an equal level playing field, as you also initially implied, Suzanne. So success is serious discussions around carbon levy, an agreement to bring forward on the IMO agenda carbon levy at MEPC 77. What is needed is, of course, a lot of studies and around how much will it cost and whom will it cost and how should it be fully structured. That is, of course, that will take place over the next half year. And then finally, what is success at MEPC? That is that politicians understand, and now I think again back to the COP26 participants, that we need a carbon levy, and it ideally should go through the IMO because shipping is a truly global business. Private enterprises, and then I finish off, what can they do? They can join forces on industry, cross-industry collaborations, whether that's engine makers and off-takers, or whether that's infrastructure providers. There's discussion earlier here or talk about safety. Ammonia, for instance, is a traded commodity today. It is a moved commodity. It just needs to be scaled up. For us, and of course, there's a lot of safety, but we also believe that all these parts can be demystified. And soon we will publicize that we're part of a large group of companies digging in on this. But that's what private enterprises can do, demystify what the implications are. And that will happen.
Great. Thank you very much. So we're looking forward to some serious discussions about a carbon levy in June. Yes, and let's get this whole topic demystified so that we can start to channel through and filter through the proper incentives to the entire industry. And the industry has the ability to handle it itself. So now, Nick, I'd like to go back to you and build on the question to Guy about developed and developing countries, and particularly about infrastructure being a prerequisite to decarbonize shipping. You talked about the timing when ships are ready to order. You've talked about the price premium. So given what we've heard from some of the other panelists, I'd like to hear a little bit more in depth about how you think that price premium can be closed. And you touched on that before, but also I'd like to hear, given your technical advice and regulatory advice, if an owner needs to order a ship today, tell us a little bit about what that decision might look like.
Okay, that's the million-dollar question, of course. Multi-million-dollar question, in fact. I would say, first of all, I think we all have a vision for zero carbon ships or zero carbon vessels to be safe, sustainable, and commercially viable by 2030. I think actually the race to zero ambition of 5% by 2030 is quite possible. I think sometimes in the shipping world, we think of all of those unique situations where ships do trade, and all of the small island states and often remote communities that maritime trade support, and we think of why hydrogen or ammonia can't get to that particular place. But I think when you look at the way that fuel is consumed in our industry today, and some of the bigger vessels and the more liner trading routes, whether they be on some of the world's biggest metal ore carriers that are trading from Brazil or Australia to China, or we look at the east-west ultra-large container ship voyages that again are going past the same ports with the same routine. I don't think we should be too afraid of the 5% target by 2030, because we wouldn't need that land-based infrastructure everywhere. I do agree with Knut. It's a hell of a road ahead to get that infrastructure and those fuels available everywhere that ships trade. But if we could get those fuels, and I agree with Kaylee Hoon that we are talking about a multiple fuel future, not a single fuel future. So we will need strategically important ports like Singapore able to offer a variety of fuels going forward. Then I think the secret really is then, how do we get those demonstrators out by 25, 26, the large scale demonstrators that Maersk have communicated in recent months that they're now considering contracting? How do we then, as an industry, gain experience of how those ships perform? What are the operational challenges? What are the training challenges, both on the shore side and on the ship side? Then I think we can rapidly ramp up. And I think governments around the world, clearly, as we march towards COP26, have an important role to play here. I think it's important also to think about the remit of IMO. So we know that IMO will be able to support what happens on the ship, but they won't be able to support or regulate or even encourage and incentivize what happens on the land side. And we've got, this is where I think the role of COP26 and key governments coming together to look at how those governments can support global trade, having a healthy, safe and green future, is really important. We shouldn't be looking to IMO to regulate everything or incentivize everything, because they'll only be able to incentivize what happens really close to the seawater. And of course, much of the supply chain of the new fuels is going to be coming from green electrons, as Rasmus pointed out. And we need other industries and those pension funds that Rasmus is talking about to be aware of how quickly the maritime industry is ready to move, and continue to work with government on the land side and on the marine side to ensure that we're aligned and we don't find ourselves in this chicken and egg situation. We need to be thinking about the whole supply chain.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, the IMO has a remit around the ship, but so much of this is about the wider supply chain, and really governments can do a lot here in coming with their NDCs to COP and incorporating the landside infrastructure. Also, we need to act now, and pilots are a way to de-risk this. So that was very interesting. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to go back to landside again, and Lei Hoon, could you talk a little bit about the role of ports and what they can do to help set green conditions for the customers?
Thanks, Suzanne, for the question. Indeed, I mean, as many of the previous speakers have said, the land infrastructure is a key point. So from Singapore's perspective, we see it from two perspectives. One is bunkering operations, and this second is port operations. So on the bunkering side, indeed, just to build on what Nick and Kanul has mentioned, it is really the point about collaboration for action. We need more pilots, we need more trials, we need companies who are forward-looking and ahead of the game to come join us so that we have this value chain ecosystem and we can receive the ships so the learning experience can accumulate. More importantly, I think we see our role really in the adoption and harmonizing of the standards for future fuels. So in this regard, just to build on what Nick mentioned, we have actually formed a future fuels port network, say with Port of Rotterdam Authority, with the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism of Japan. So there are 3 keynotes, and we are looking at other players from different parts of the world, so that should we be able to conduct a trial successfully, say ammonia with Lloyd's, the Castor initiative, or with MERS, and then with DNV in other aspects. We are also in pilot trials on biofuel. We are also in pilot trials on, say, even carbon capture, or we are talking about methanol, ethanol. So we are trying to get Singapore into this different value chain ecosystem. And then you can have a good conversation with the energy companies, with the ship registry, with the car society, with the ship companies. And from there, once you have the different trials going on, I'm quite glad Guy mentioned he has 200 projects in his hand. So I'm looking forward to link up with him to see how we can come and play a part and work with this future fuel port network to develop the bunkering trials and standards. So that's one. On the port side, it's not just Singapore. There are various ports also who are looking at test bedding initiative. So for example, on the equipment side, how do we actually use fully electric power container handling equipment? We are looking at LNG fueled prime movers. So PSA Corporation is also looking at potentially hydrogen fueled cell autonomous vehicles. So these are various initiatives which from the authority, we provide some incentives in terms of funding scheme, like through some green funds to actually spur the adoption of such initiative, which could help greenify our port as well as domestic hovercraft. So these are the 2 tracks we are working on. First, on the bunkering operations side, and second, on the port infrastructure side. I just want to build on one point which Guy mentioned as well. It really is the inclusive model, which you have been asking the different panelists. And indeed, at the IMO level, the inclusive model is also bringing different member states along, and this requires capacity building. It requires sharing of knowledge. So we work with IMO on a next gen initiative in terms of sharing experiences with other member states and all member states to form that collaborative approach. So that's important. And therefore, any funds that's being set up should also look at the capacity building, albeit understanding that the fund also needs to go to the industry to pursue concrete projects for commercialization. So that's just one part on the inclusive agenda I wanted to add in from the port perspective.
Thanks. You're really doing a lot to create these ecosystems, and the sharing the knowledge and the capacity building, sharing with member states and putting funds towards that. You're building a holistic effort there, and interesting to think about your bunkering side and the port side and the way you're hitting it from lots of different directions in terms of the incentives. Thank you. Turning back to Knut now, and I wanted to talk a little bit and ask you about the science-based targets aligned with 1.5 degrees and getting companies to sign up to those. Right now, actually, there's only one shipping company, Maersk, that has signed up. So how can we increase this number? And actually, and once companies put out their strategies to get to net zero, how do you make sure they're actually doing that?
Well, I think it's really important that many companies are now looking at their options and where can they contribute. I think that is really the starting point. And we talked about the R&D, and piloting was mentioned. I think that is so crucial that we get, different types of fuels tested out. And in many cases, the short sea arena is really a fantastic laboratory for testing out some of these new fuel types. And the experience gained in these areas can then be translated and further taken on to the deep sea shipping. So I would say piloting is really much more important than words on a piece of paper with very high ambitions. And we can have as many declarations as we want, but if we don't have the solutions, it's just, words on a piece of paper. So piloting is important, but I would also say that it's also important to look beyond the maritime industry and to the oil and gas industry, the importance of carbon capture and storage, for instance. There is so much gas available in the world, and for sure that gas will be there and it will be exploited. But if we could find really good solutions on carbon capture and storage, then we would also have a net zero fuel offering based on this source. And then my last point, I know the time is running out, so I'll be short on this one. My last point is really on the renewable sector. I think there is so much potential, especially on the offshore wind activity, and we see development now in many areas of the world, and that on top of the solar opportunities that was also mentioned. I think these are really, you know, fantastic energy sources that could give us, you know, a really good carbon-free fuel in the future. But mind you, it is in the future still. We still have to close the gap of getting from the real world today into where we want to be tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yep. So let's get action going today and just start through the pilot, start experiencing, start finding out what are the issues are. We're going to be looking at a multi-fuel future for a while, but there's some exciting new developing fuels that will eventually play a big part of this. Our time has run out, but I wanted to say very big thank you to all of you. I learned so much. I hope everybody did in this meeting today. We have an ambitious agenda, and it's interesting to hear each of you talk about how shipping can end up being on the right side of history. All eyes are going to be looking in June at the MEPC, but later in November to COP. But this is a transition, but there's significant action that we can be taking now. And as Nick said, we're going to be seeing these dual use ships in the water in just a couple of years. So what can we do today to make that go as safely as possible, looking at landside infrastructure all the way through to the end users and finance. So thank you. It was a terrific panel. I thank you all and wish everybody a safe and enjoyable day.
Thank you.
Thank you.